think that this place is truly living out the meaning of the word sanctuary. And by that I don't mean the beautiful building. I really mean the place that creates a safe environment for people to re-explore a way of living out their spiritual religious life in community.
There's a kind of bold, almost reckless quality to the assumption that you can have a thriving, not just a marginal, but a thriving religious community that is decidedly not like the dominant way of life. And yet it resembles any other church.
I think it resonates with people searching for a place that allows them to ask questions, to incorporate a variety of aspects of their spiritual journeys, their learning journeys, their service journeys. A ministry connected to education and a ministry connected to pastoral care is really about people more than it is about the programs I'm responsible for or even my role as a pastor.
There's as many different stories as there are people out there.
My message of you belong here means, yes, even if no one else wants to hear you, we will give you a hearing. Not because you're right, but because unless we hear all the points of view, we will inevitably close ranks around a partial truth, not a whole truth.
I really want to know what gifts people want to bring, what are their passions, and how can we match that passion with some need that we have.
And when I bump into people on both sides of need and ability in that, who are helping each other in different ways, that's when I'm most inspired. The question is, can we pick up the energy that both honors the great traditions and speaks them in a way that's relevant to what happened in the newspaper yesterday? And then I was standing on the highest mountain of them all, and round beneath me was the whole hoop of the world. And while I stood there, I saw more than I can tell, and I understood more than I saw, for I was seeing in the sacred manner. Yes. And the shape of all things of the Spirit, and the shapes as they must live like one being. And I saw that the sacred hoop of my people was one of many hoops that make one circle, wide as daylight and starlight, and in the center grew one mighty flowering tree. I invite you to worship, to a time in which we plant by your presence one mighty flowering tree of the Spirit of your lives that gathers together to celebrate and to mourn, to laugh and to cry, to be as you would have need this day. This is the gift that awaits. Won't you fully enter and come in?
My name is Jenny Kinne, and I'm so honored to be here this morning as a part of the Summer Speaker Series. I know many of you, so I am a Fountain Streeter myself. So I used to work here at Fountain Street a few years ago as the Volunteer Ministries Coordinator. So I spent a lot of time here, and it's very different for me to be up front instead of in the background, so I'm a little nervous today. But I still, although I don't work at Fountain Street anymore, I'm still here on a regular basis. I serve on the board of the Fountain Street Church Choice Fund. And the reason that I'm here today is because of all of the work that I do in public policy. And since you don't have a bio for me in your program, I just wanted to welcome you by introducing myself before we get into some of the more serious topics this morning. So I currently work for the Michigan League for Public Policy as their community engagement specialist. So I do a ton of research and education on many different public policy issues that touch on economic equity. And before this, I worked at Planned Parenthood as an organizer. So I really hope that I can bring some of my experience and my insights to you all this morning. And I just really appreciate you taking the time to be here and talk public policy in a pretty difficult world. So with that, I'd like to invite you to be a part of our responsive invocation, which you'll find in your program. Actually, before I do that, I want to introduce you to my friend who's on the piano today. So if you want to sneak out, this is Christopher Rowe. Thanks, Chris. Chris helped me put together this whole program. We've really poured our hearts into everything in the program today, including the readings, the music, the sermon. So we're really trying to put together a great experience for you all. So thank you, Chris, for being here. Thanks. All right, so let's get started on the invocation. May we recognize and abandon the familiar attitudes and practices that do not serve the whole. We are who we are, and we have the opportunity to be who we want to be, to create a new inheritance for the future. May our thoughts, words, and actions in our daily lives assist in dismantling paradigms of oppression and suffering. May we give thanks for our individual place in time and space, to our families and our relationships that touch and change us. Underneath and within these stories and histories is our humanity. Being human means we are of these earth. We are these waters, we are fire and atmosphere, we are the sun and the moon and the stars. We are all that we see, and the wisdom is revealed in between. take a moment to meditate on an issue that's been really close to my heart recently, and I'm sure has been affecting us all in one way or another. So if you wouldn't mind joining me in a prayer and meditation, a prayer of protection for children crossing the U.S.-Mexico border. I'm sure we've all been paying close attention to the news, and many of you may be aware that we have children in Grand Rapids currently who are still seeking reconnection with their parents. So please join me in a meditation of protection for these children. We pray for children from Central America who, seeking safety, make the dangerous journey to the U.S.-Mexico border. For parents who travel beside their children, for parents who must remain at home, and for parents who have gone ahead. For children being held in temporary immigration and customs enforcement shelters across this country. For Border Patrol and immigration officials, that they would respond with compassion to the children in their care. For the churches and humanitarian organizations, especially those in the border region of this country, that will respond with open doors. For children who are reunited with family in the United States. For children who now face deportation. For children who return to the fear they tried to escape. For the countries of Central America experiencing the crises of poverty and violence. For the United States, as we see the result of U.S. foreign policies that have destabilized Central America. And for all people, as we strive to honor and protect our children. Let's take a moment of silence. Thank you very much for doing that with me.
An excerpt from Our Grandmothers by Maya Angelou. She lay, skin down in the moist dirt, the canebrake rustling with the whispers of leaves and loud longing of hounds and the ransack of hunters crackling the near branches. She muttered, lifting her head, a nod toward freedom. I shall not be moved. In Virginia tobacco fields, leaning into the curve of Steinway pianos, along Arkansas roads in the red hills of Georgia, into the palms of her chained hands, she cried against calamity. You have tried to destroy me, and though I perish daily, I shall not be moved. These mama faces, lemon yellow, plum purple, honey brown, have grimaced and twisted down a pyramid for years. She is Sheba the Sojourner, Harriet the Zora, Mary Bethune and Angela Annie to Zenobia. She stands before the abortion clinic, confounded by the lack of choices, and the welfare line reduced to the pity of handouts, ordained in the pulpit, shielded by the mysteries, in the operating room, husbanding life, in the choir loft, holding God in her throat, on lonely street corners, hawking her body, in the classroom, loving the children to understanding. Centered on the world's stage, she sings to her loves and beloveds, to her foes and detractors. However I am perceived and deceived, however my ignorance and conceits, lay aside your fears that I will be undone, for I shall not be moved.
Thank you, Jason, for that phenomenal reading of Maya Angelou. Maya Angelou is one of my favorite writers, and I so rarely get to talk about her in the context of my political being and my political work. So I'm so glad that I get to do that a little bit today. When I was invited to come here and be a part of the Summer Speaker Series, I was super honored but very nervous. I was asked to pick a topic that I cared about. That's all I was told. Pick a topic that you care about that you could somehow contribute to based on your own insights and life experiences. What I've worked on for most of my young life is grassroots activism to change public policy. So I've come to know many kinds of public policies inside and out, and I know I've spoken with many of you about the various policies that I'm working on, and I think I've gained significant insight into how policies affect us and what positive change and reform is going to require of us as a community. Working in public policy right now is intellectually, emotionally, and morally challenging, just as I'm sure it's challenging to watch the news, be on social media, be a part of this world currently. I've spent countless hours over the past year and a half urging people to pay attention to certain policies, call their representatives, set up town halls, hold meetings, and the list goes on and on. But I don't want to do that today. I'm not going to give you my normal talking points, my normal line about what we should do in order to make political change. I think sometimes, and I'm just as guilty of this as anyone, I think sometimes in our fast-paced clickbait culture, we know so much about what is happening in the world. We see headlines about laws being passed, bills being introduced, fundings cut, the pressing statistics of the day, that we end up losing something fundamental. Not only are we losing the living dimension of these policy decisions, aka us, people, and the environment, in our furious consumption of information, we also miss the rot at public policy's core that has oppressed generations of people while passing these systemic inequities off as freedom of opportunity. To explain how public policy shapes opportunity and impacts our most personal spaces, I think it's vital that we spend a lot more time sharing our own stories and listening to the stories of others. So this morning, I want to get away from all of the bill tracking, phone calls, social media debates, if only for a moment, to study how public policy has impacted who we are as individuals and who we are as a society. So by way of example, I'm going to do something that's a little uncomfortable for me. I'm going to bring you through some of my story, some of the most formative moments in my personal story. And there are pictures, so y'all are lucky today. So I grew up right around here in Kentwood and was certainly raised in what some people call West Michigan nice culture. So these are my parents, and my little sister is the baby in that photo. So my parents are wonderful people. I know some of you have met them. They taught me to love and respect everyone regardless of difference. But I'm not going to lie, they, along with my extended family, definitely taught me to avoid uncomfortable talk. So you don't talk about politics and religion in my household, and certainly not in my extended family's households. To this day, I always leave political conversations feeling a bit guilty and embarrassed. And you might not guess this about me because I talk about politics all the time, but that internal feeling is always there for me. That discomfort runs deep. I've done this for 10 years now, and I still feel it all the time. But I don't feel that I was given a choice in my life to avoid politics. I don't think very many people my age in America were given this choice. The whole world turned into a political minefield when I was in 6th grade. I'm among the last generation that will remember witnessing 9/11 firsthand. I remember a friend of mine being called out of class because her cousin had been killed in the plane that went down over the fields of Pennsylvania. I remember another friend of mine of Indian descent being harassed in the hallways words being passed directly from the Islamophobic mouths of my peers' parents. My middle school became a reflection of the national conversation, and despite how young we all were, we all took part, inevitably. When Obama became the Democratic nominee for president in 2008, my soul was on fire. This was a big moment of political awakening for me. I remember working the polls on Election Day in Southeast Washington, D.C., which went 99% for Obama. That's true. Entire families, 3 generations worth of voters, mostly African American, came and voted together, and it was without a doubt the most spiritual experience I have ever had. I cried with strangers. Families and strangers were crying together, hardly believing how far we had come since the abolition of slavery and the civil rights movement. This hope was taking place in the midst of a severe economic crisis that disrupted many of my friends' lives and left so many people homeless in Washington, D.C., that parks grew overcrowded and shelters hit their limits. This same economic crisis left many people my age, including myself, with a ton of debt and scant hope of full-time employment. This sowed within me a distrust of the financial system, the wealthy, and the American bootstraps mentality from a very young age. I remember the passage of the Affordable Care Act, a groundbreaking feat that sought health insurance for all. This seemingly impossible policy change began to break down the fatal myths that our life's value should be tied up in our employment and that healthcare is a privilege. Instead, with this law, it became a right. I was back here in Grand Rapids. I was in the midst of running an Affordable Care Act enrollment and education program, which was so inspiring for me. When my mom's sister, my Aunt Lori, was diagnosed with liver cancer. And thankfully, she had insurance of her own, but I will never be able to forget sitting in hospice with my aunt as she worried about being able to afford her medical treatment. No one's last moments should be spent in fear of medical expense. And I grew even more dedicated to make sure that no one else had to go through that. I remember pictures. I remember every painful blow I received as a pro-choice activist with Planned Parenthood and the Fountain Street Church Choice Fund. Unfortunately, the memories that stick out, I remember every single time I've been called a slut, a murderer, selfish, and my very favorite, a heathen Jezebel. I remember when I finally grew brave enough to tell my own story, I was not only attacked by those same people, but I was also torn down by my friends, people who were supposed to support me, who wanted me to stay quiet, hidden, not make people so uncomfortable. For the first time in my activism, I fought against paralyzing bitterness and pessimism. But at the same time, I was surrounded by all these people. So I was surrounded by the most inspiring and intelligent activists I have met in my life, and they got me through a tough period and certainly taught me how to toughen my own skin. You might recognize the photo on the right. It's in the lobby right outside. This was my last event as a Planned Parenthood organizer right after the 2016 election. So we had even more people than that. Hundreds of people showed up to figure out what they could do. Finally, I remember November 8th, 2016. I worked for months dreaming and sort of envisioning a future that I believed in. And I did this through my work canvassing, and you'll see the photo on the right is my parents. So my dad, who is a very devout Reagan Republican. That is him attending a Hillary Clinton rally. And I got this text from them while I was at the rally, and it's one of my favorite texts I've ever gotten, just that moment of, even though my parents and I are so different, we love each other enough that we're willing to work together and create a future that is good and healthy and vibrant. But, of course, on November 8th, 2016, the world seemed to turn upside down. Dystopian predictions became real as Trump utilized every racist and sexist trick in the book to gain access to the world's most powerful elected office. Like many of you, I'm sure, I was in deep shock. Images of 2008 and 2012 kept flickering in my mind, and I could not figure out where we'd gone so wrong. I tell you all of this to explain how I've become the person that I am today. My worldview, as well as the ways that I interact with everyone around me, are deeply informed by both historical and contemporary public policy decisions. And my experience is unique. Obviously, my experience is going to be vastly different from someone who grew up on the other side of the world or even on another street in Grand Rapids. My experiences imbue me with unique knowledge and glaring blind spots. I've learned, especially over the past couple years, that identifying those blind spots within myself is vital to my working for any sort of political or cultural change. After 2016, I got a big wake-up call. All of my political blind spots were revealed, and I'm sure that some of you out there can relate to this, right? How did this happen? I started listening to the voices of my friends and some thought leaders from across the country who were asking a tough but important question: why are you so surprised? A huge chunk of our progressive populace, namely people of color and immigrants, saw this election coming. Or perhaps that's not the best way of putting it. They saw that this reality, the Trump reality, was already present and active in our culture and political system. So I've meditated on this question a lot in the past year and a half. Why was I so surprised? Why did other people see a reality underneath the surface of American politics that I had completely missed? This question has led me through countless hours of reading, researching, and listening to others' stories. In the words of one of my favorite authors, you'll notice I'm going to mention a lot of writers today, Richard Powers, life has a way of talking to the future. It's called memory. To solve the future, we must save the past. If my memories reveal so much about how public policies have influenced who I am, it only makes sense that listening to the stories of many other people can reveal how policies have shaped our culture as a whole. So let's work on some past saving. What led us here? How have policies influenced us and our culture to lead to our present reality? And what do we have a responsibility to do once we have this information? Lots of people are asking these questions right now. These are not questions that I came up with on my own. But the problem is that many of the people who are asking these questions are getting pushed back with rebukes like, "We don't have time for this. What do we need to do now to prevent this policy? Everything seems so urgent, like we need to be responding to things and not paying attention to these larger questions." There seems to be an understanding among certain groups of people that talking about the past is an indulgence in an era of so many pressing issues. But we really, really need to stop thinking like this. I'm sure that it seems counterintuitive to many of us, and I'm guilty of this working in policy day in and day out. But we absolutely must slow down and take time to understand our nation's history and the experiences of our neighbors if we have any hope of changing future public policy and building healthier communities. This is deep work that I'm talking about. It's not easy, it's very time consuming, and it can feel really hopeless and overwhelming at times. But I know that this is how I must forge ahead in order to become a better human being and a better justice advocate. The first thing that we all need to do, I believe, is to create spaces in our lives in which we can safely welcome people and have conversations about our lives, our hardships, and dreams. These are inherently political conversations. They might not always feel like they're political, but that's when you know you're doing a good job. These conversations will build community, and through these communities, we can build a vision for our world that is truly grassroots and inherently powerful. We also need to do a lot of self-work. So I'm going to do something I have always wanted to do. I'm going to give you some book recommendations that are integral to my own political consciousness. Every one of these sources has inspired me to think deeply about how public policy informs the way I treat other people. They have also taught me how policy has shaped our culture. Some even get to the root causes of our society's biggest problems. So currently in the US, we have 2.3 million people in prisons, jails, and in detention facilities. In the documentary, okay, this one isn't a book. In the documentary 13th, Ava DuVernay reveals the direct trajectory from slavery to mass incarceration through an examination of the 13th Amendment, which states that slavery in the US is unconstitutional except for in the case of incarceration. Following the end of slavery, laws changed across the country that made it easier to incarcerate Black people, particularly Black men, to once again have access to a free source of labor. The new Jim Crow, this is a book, also follows the line from slavery to mass incarceration and calls into question policies from the formation of the American slave trade to the war on drugs to modern-day sentencing, all of which have trained Americans to view and treat Black men as criminals. Systemic racism has become a term often cited by the progressive movement, but how many of us actually know what systemic racism means, and how do we know that it exists? To answer these questions, I highly recommend these books. Both of which explain the generational impacts of slavery and racial discrimination, while also zooming out on public policy decisions that have cemented racial prejudices. Both of these books do a phenomenal job at sort of complicating our conversations about what it means to be free. The path from slavery to freedom is not a straight path, and freedom is often illusory and mythic, so people end up being caught in all sorts of webs of oppression and discrimination, oftentimes that go unnoticed in our society, and these books bring those realities straight to the surface. Homegoing is fiction for any fiction readers out there, and The Color of the Law is a nonfiction piece. Both are integral reads if you want to understand systemic racism. So how did we get here? The problems of the world seem far too urgent and catastrophic to take time to answer this question, but I think it's the only way forward. Many people have been calling on us to relearn history. Look at the Black Lives Matter movement, the Native rights movement at Standing Rock. Look at writers like Maya Angelou or Austin Channing Brown, who's quoted in your program. They're all calling on us to understand what has happened in this nation's history. We need a lot more than calls to representatives today, although please still do that. We need to undergo a collective reckoning in which we get to know our past and use that knowledge to shape public policies that protect and honor our communities and our planet. So please talk to your neighbors, read a book, and have some uncomfortable conversations in which you share your own story and listen to the stories of others. If anyone wants to form a book club with any of these books, I'm more than open to it. So thank you for taking the time this morning to listen to my story, and I really look forward to getting to know yours. All right. I missed something. Okay, so now we're going to join in hymn number 134, Our World is One World.